Thanks for joining us on the show, Bolaji. Great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Rolaka.
So the first story we wanted to talk about is unemployment rose and wage growth also slowed in the UK. What exactly is happening in the UK economy? It seems like it bounces back and then it takes a turn. So help us make sense of some of these recent figures.
Well, so unemployment rates were at 3.8% and it's gone up to 3.9% with just over 16,000 people claiming unemployment benefits in the period. I think we were to expect these kinds of fluctuations in the economy, especially where it came to jobs, following the few years that we've had with Brexit, the pandemic, the war in Europe, mainland Europe, and all the other disruptions going on around the world. So there has been a cooling of wage increases as well as, a cooling of employment, recruitment in the country. So we actually expected these numbers to go up slightly.
Yeah, so not a surprise, but how does this tie in with a lot of the news we're seeing around sort of controlling immigration? The UK government has been doing a lot. It's introduced new rules for care workers. For instance, that used to be a steady flow of migrants from Africa, from the Caribbean and parts of the world. I'm trying to understand the policy on immigration with regards to employment and getting work permits and some of the statistics we're seeing.
Well, as you know, this is a big election year, and we have seen a lot of pressure on public services over the recent past. And I think the government is trying to make sure that they're controlling immigration in such a way that the government public services will not be under the pressure that they have been under. As you know, NHS waiting times are still at an all-time high. A&E waiting times are still considered around 4 to 6 hours. And it's just something that cannot be controlled easily. We also have the problem, obviously, of the channel. And the boat's still coming in, and so you have quite a lot of illegal migration coming into the UK. So the government is looking for various ways to stem this, and I think the dependence policy has become one of those strategies.
So the dependence policy is a policy that is limiting your ability to bring independence when you're coming to work in the UK. But the point about the NHS, if we're seeing these waiting times and these problems with getting appointments, isn't that a reflection of a staffing shortage? So surely, if you're limiting the amount of dependence, that's just going to dissuade people from coming overseas to apply for jobs, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this is the loud gong that we're hearing, whether that's on the internet or from groups, medical groups, particularly talking about the fact that there is no doctor, there is no nurse that's going to uproot their lives from across the world to come and serve the NHS without their families with them.
Yeah.
And so many people think that it's quite an unsavory policy. But like I said, the government is looking for various ways to stem immigration at the moment, and the voting population is actually quite sensitive to this issue.
Yeah, interesting dynamics in an election. Yeah, it's never ever that straightforward. Let's go to another issue. Nigeria's government has deferred, postponed, or put on hold the student loan scheme, which was meant to give interest-free loans for higher education to Nigerian students. Of course, the principle behind this is probably quite sound because we know the impact of a good education on outcomes in terms of development and the economy. But what do you think is responsible for this pullback in launching this policy?
Well, I think one of the major issues that we face in Nigeria is the fact that policies are created without a long-term strategy in mind. And I think because there were very few appointments that had been made to very key offices when this policy was initially introduced.
Yeah, because it was introduced very early on.
Yes, very early on, without the people who were actually meant to implement this policy in position. So obviously this would have meant that they would have come into position, done a little bit more thinking through on the policy, including the numbers, and found out that it probably wasn't something that was sustainable and didn't want to actually start it without coming up with a plan to sustain it. And I think that's where the issues have been. But I would have liked to see a bit more transparency on the reasons why from the government.
Yeah, we don't know the reasons why, but I'm sure most Nigerians or observers of the Nigerian economy and some of the challenges around kind of revenue growth, revenue generation, limited FX income, and those financial and credit constraints can deduce some of the challenges. But The question then is, there is clearly an issue around higher education, right?
Yes,
And we need to find ways to incentivize students to go through higher education and ensure that our educational system is positioned to better serve the economy.
Yeah.
So do you see this potentially being reintroduced in the future?
I think it's imperative for it to be introduced in the future, because one of the biggest issues that's causing inflation at the moment is our dependency on imports. And this moves back to productivity problems. And productivity cannot go up if you don't have people in the right positions in the real sector, for instance. So I think that the only way to really encourage people to come into the job market is to actually get an education. So I think the government really needs to rethink this policy and bring it in. Whether or not they need some support to do this is another thing that we need to think about.
And of course, it may not be interest-free. It could be subsidized or concessionary loans. But interest-free in this market would be quite a tough sell, given the economic constraints. Well, let's look at other stories now. Of course, Nigeria is still a big one. We're talking about agriculture, the farm input story out of Nigeria, and then the fertilizer supply. What do you think the overall strategy of the Nigerian government here is with regards to the agricultural sector?
Well, as always, food security is always a priority for every government. And right now, the production output is just not matching our population growth. We can't meet the agricultural and food supply needs that our nation currently has. And that is further exacerbated by what we're seeing in the north with the security issues, and the fact that farmers are no longer feeling safe in their growing activities. Processing centres have shut down.
Well, it's not just in the north, actually. It's in different parts.
It's in different parts of the country. Yeah, absolutely. We're currently working on a project with hundreds of thousands of farmers, and one of the major concerns is security. So these are some of the underlying issues that are causing the surge in food prices. And whilst I do endorse a short-term solution that can just cool down some of the issues that are currently taking place, I don't think it's a long-term solution, because, market distortions, you're then looking at an artificial pricing for food. And then once those subsidies are taken off...
This is with regards to the farm inputs.
Yes, absolutely. So once you once you take away subsidies on farm inputs, what's going to happen is that food prices will shoot up again.
Yeah, and of course, the issue of fertilizers, 100 billion naira worth of fertilizers, which the central bank has handed over to the Ministry of Agriculture because it's sort of playing to its role of price stability. What do you make of that?
Once again, I think it's very important that the central bank intervenes in this way, and I think it's necessary because, as you know, fertilizer is something that is used widespread across the country. However, once again, I do worry about the long-term effect that it will have on food supply and production.
Yeah, indeed. But from one agricultural story to another, the value of Kenya's tea exports actually increased 31%. Good news for Kenya, but it's also on the back of the devaluation of the Kenyan shilling, the depreciation of the Kenyan shilling. What do you make of that?
Well, once again, you're looking at 33% of Kenya's GDP. Is the tea industry is responsible for 33%. That's a big number.
Yeah.
And at the moment, there are a series of reasons why tea around the world is currently scarce. And we know that, you alluded to just earlier on in your program about the issues that are going on in the Red Sea. So obviously, the price of sending their tea across the world, particularly to Russia, and Ukraine, has gone up considerably. So if you look at all of these factors, that's, I think, the reason for the increased value of the tea from Kenya.
Yeah, just speaking on trade, because I know you do a lot of work on trade and African trade, and one of the things that we still know is a problem is that levels of trade within Africa have not been as buoyant as Africa's trade with the world. Now, this is a good story of Kenya's value of tea exports going up to the world. What can we do to encourage export growth in many African countries beyond just hard commodities like energy, so non-oil exports and exports of agricultural commodities?
Well, I think governments need to provide an enabling environment for production to grow. And then we will start to see the increase in food and, value-added products across Africa and outside of Africa. I don't know if you're aware that Egypt tried to barter some commodities with Kenya for their tea because of the constraints around foreign exchange. And this has forced some intra-Africa trade. So I think what governments need to do is improve that enabling environment, the infrastructure across the continent to improve on trade.
And what are some of your clients saying about trading within the African continent? What are some of the latest issues that are evolving? What are some of the pain points you're seeing with regards to intra-Africa trade?
Most of my clients are still saying that it's easier to trade with Europe and the US than to trade with the rest of Africa because of the infrastructure issues. You know that many countries in Africa are actually landlocked. So when you're talking about trade, intra-Africa trade, you have to consider the fact that there are many African countries that don't have seaports. And so transporting goods across borders is still quite problematic. And of course, the AfCFTA policies have not quite trickled down to local borders. And so it is still quite difficult to get paperwork to go across borders as well. So what you're finding is there's a buildup of trucks trying to cross borders and confusion around the right paperwork and all of these things. So we really need to put some capacity building in place for customs officers, as well as those responsible for the trade, for the easy flow of goods and services across borders around Africa.
Yeah. Looking at some of the flows that are happening across the region, do we have an idea of the quantum or size of some of these trade flows that are happening across the continent? Because whilst we're seeing some constraints in formal trade, we know there's a big informal trade market.
Yes, I was going to say that.
Continent. Yeah. So, how does that sort of position itself versus the more formal trade?
I think what most experts will tell you is that informal trade is a lot higher than what people think. You can't measure what you can't, you're not tracking, right? And I think that informal trade contributes much more to the wider African economy than we can actually measure. And I think what we're finding now is that there are all kinds of initiatives in place to try to measure this informal trade. And I think one of those things that needs to be done is a digitization of the trade regime across the continent so that these can be tracked a lot more effectively.
Yes, and in fact, I think a sector that will help with that and facilitate trade is payments, Fintech. The Africa Fintech Summit is obviously taking place this year in DC on the sidelines of the IMF World Bank meetings. Fintech in Africa has really grown. There's a plethora of companies, startups, entities that are providing solutions across Africa and helping to facilitate trade and exports. What do you make of the growth of Fintech and where the industry stands in this point in history?
Fascinatingly enough, $6 billion in equity has gone into Fintech, and that's growing at a compound annual growth rate of 57% year on year.
57% year on year. That's massive.
It's huge. It's transformational. And I think one of the interesting things about Fintech is that, this informal economy that we're talking about, it's formalizing the informal sector.
Okay.
It's bringing down the cost of transactions across the continent, and it's causing more people to go into business. And so I think, one of the things that I always talk about and always emphasize is the fact that innovation is what is needed in Africa to catapult us into the future that we all want. And I think Fintech has been one of those good success stories coming out of the continent.
Yeah, you mentioned that it's formalizing the informal sector, and that's a very interesting dynamic. But looking at a lot of the Fintech startups, despite the $6 billion that you've mentioned, we're still seeing some rate of failure, false starts with some of these businesses. What are they going to need to scale to continue to innovate and provide the solutions that Africa needs?
I think there's a lot of figuring out that needs to be done. Mobile phone penetration is still between 40 and 60% in some countries. So I think in a lot of cases, we overestimate how many people are actually using mobile phones for financial transactions, especially when some of these valuations come out and some of these projections come out for some of these fintech firms. And I think what we need to do is sit back and be a little bit patient about the growth of this industry. There is definitely a lot of potential for fintech in Africa, but I think there's still quite a lot of infrastructure. You're talking a little bit about the internet and the dependence on ICT infrastructure. That still has quite a way to go in terms of its development. So these are some of the, extenuating factors that are affecting the growth of the industry. But I think with all the false starts, there's a lot of figuring out. I think it will start to stabilize and things will start getting better.
Yes, indeed. I know you advise a lot of businesses that go to Africa. Just very briefly, last point is, what are the sectors of interest now in Africa and countries like Nigeria to foreign investors? Are we seeing any new trends emerging?
Not many new trends. I wouldn't say we're seeing new trends. What we're seeing is market development in existing trends.
Okay.
So, for instance, you're finding that investors are still interested in our financial infrastructure and the finance industry. As you know, it is quite sophisticated. And I usually say this whenever I'm given a chance to, that we have quite a sophisticated finance sector. So investors are still interested in that. Yeah, in Nigeria. Yeah. The other trend is fast-moving consumer goods. So even though that has slowed quite significantly in recent past, because of the foreign exchange problems, investors are beginning to realize that that presents an opportunity for local production and manufacturing. So what they're looking at is local manufacturing companies that they can invest money into so that they can start to supply, to fill that gap, that supply gap that is existing now because of the high foreign exchange concerns. So these are some of the things that we're seeing more recently. I think Nigeria is being watched quite carefully by the City of London and other financial centers. But I think that there's obviously still a lot of potential in the Nigerian market.
Yeah, indeed. Lots of potential, lots of challenges, which hopefully we will surmount. Thank you so much for chatting with us today on a host of global African and Nigeria topics. I've been speaking to Bolaji Sofoluwe, co-founder and managing director of ETK Group. Well, I hope you enjoyed the show today. It's a mix of issues, and we can continue the conversation online. So do follow me on X if you would like to. And have a great rest of the weekend. Stay safe. I'm Rolake Akikugbe Filani, and I'll see you next time.